Harold Whitmore had built an empire worth $12 billion, but at 78, he couldn't build a simple conversation with the people who worked in his home. The marble floors of his estate stretched endlessly, and somewhere in those vast hallways, he heard footsteps. Quick, careful, trying not to disturb. Maria's footsteps. His housekeeper of 15 years moved through his mansion like a ghost, and he'd grown so accustomed to her silence that he'd forgotten she had a voice beyond yes, Mr. Whitmore, and right away, sir. That Tuesday morning changed everything. Harold had dozed off in his study after reviewing quarterly reports, his reading glasses sliding down his nose, his breathing deep and even. Maria entered quietly to collect the breakfast tray, moving with practiced efficiency. But then something unusual happened. A phone vibrated on the mahogany side table. Not Harold's phone. Maria's. She froze, glancing at the sleeping billionaire, then carefully pulled out her phone. Her whispered conversation drifted through the room. "Miguel, honey, I can't. No, I'm at work. The scholarship committee meets when? Today." Her voice cracked slightly. $4,000 for the semester deposit? By tomorrow. Harold kept his eyes closed, his breathing steady. He heard Maria's sharp intake of breath, the way she pressed her palm against her mouth to muffle a sob. "We'll figure it out, Mijo. You earned that scholarship to medical school. We'll find a way." The call ended. Maria stood there for a moment, shoulders shaking silently. Then she straightened, wiped her eyes, and continued clearing the tray as if nothing had happened. The study door clicked shut behind her. Harold's eyes opened. He stared at the ceiling, processing what he'd just heard. 15 years. Maria had worked in his home for 15 years, and he knew nothing about her beyond her efficiency with silver polish and her ability to keep fresh orchids in every room. He didn't even know she had a son. The realization settled in his chest like a stone. He'd built a fortress of wealth around himself so thoroughly that he'd become furniture in his own home, something to clean around, to serve, but never to truly see or be seen by. If you enjoy stories about unexpected connections and second chances, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Harold spent the rest of that morning doing something he hadn't done in decades, paying attention, really paying attention. He noticed how Maria's hand trembled slightly as she arranged fresh towels in the guest bathroom. He saw the way she checked her phone every few minutes, hope and disappointment flickering across her face with each notification that wasn't the one she needed. That afternoon, Harold made a decision, not a grand gesture. He'd learned long ago that throwing money at problems was just another form of control. Instead, he did something simpler and far more difficult. He walked into the kitchen where Maria was preparing dinner. "Maria," he said, and she nearly dropped the cutting board. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm sorry. Dinner will be ready at 7 as usual." "I heard your phone call this morning," Harold said quietly. "I wasn't fully asleep." The color drained from Maria's face. Her hands gripped the counter. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm so sorry. Personal calls during work hours are inexcusable. It won't happen again. Your son got into medical school." Maria's eyes darted to his face, searching for anger, finding something else she couldn't quite identify. "Yes, sir. You see, San Francisco. Full scholarship for tuition, but—" She stopped herself. "But they need a deposit for housing and fees," Harold finished. $4,000 by tomorrow." Maria nodded, her jaw tight. "I'll handle it, Mr. Whitmore. It won't affect my work." Harold studied her face, really looked at her for perhaps the first time. She was younger than he'd assumed, maybe early 50s. There were photos tucked into her wallet that she'd pulled out with her phone earlier. A young man in a graduation cap, bright smile in Maria's eyes. "I'd like to help," Harold said. Maria stepped back as if he'd struck her. "Mr. Whitmore, I couldn't. That's not. I don't take charity." "Not charity. A loan. Interest-free, but a loan nonetheless. You pay it back however you can, whenever you can." Maria's hand shook. "Why would you do that?" Harold was quiet for a moment, looking out the kitchen window at his manicured gardens. Because I just realized I've lived in this house for 20 years and never once asked about your life. Because your son earned a full scholarship to medical school, and I didn't even know you had a son. Because I've forgotten what it means to be part of something instead of above it. Maria's eyes filled with tears she wouldn't let fall. Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate the offer, but I can't. There are boundaries. You're my employer. You're right, Harold said. There are boundaries. And I've hidden behind them for so long that I've forgotten there are people on the other side. He pulled out his checkbook, wrote the check, and placed it on the counter. The money is there if you need it. No strings, no expectations. Just neighbor to neighbor. Maria stared at the check, but didn't touch it. I'll think about it, she said finally. Harold nodded and left the kitchen. That evening, dinner appeared at 7 as always, but the check remained on the counter, untouched. The next morning, Harold found the check on his desk with a note. Thank you for the offer, Mr. Whitmore. I've managed to arrange things another way. Maria. Harold knew she was lying. He'd overheard her on another call, desperately trying to get payday loan at a crushing interest rate. But he also understood pride. God, did he understand pride? It had built his fortune and destroyed his family. His own son hadn't spoken to him in 5 years, not since Harold had tried to control his career choices with threats and financial manipulation. So Harold tried a different approach. Over the following days, he began asking Maria small questions while she worked. Nothing invasive, just human conversation. The roses are particularly beautiful today, aren't they? This rain reminds me of Seattle. Have you ever been? That smells wonderful. What spices are you using? At first, Maria answered with the same professional courtesy she'd always used. But gradually, something shifted. She mentioned that Miguel had loved chemistry sets as a child, that he'd volunteered at free clinics through college, that he studied by flashlight during power outages rather than miss a single day of preparation. Harold found himself sharing too, tentatively, carefully, how he'd started his company in a garage, how his wife had left him because he loved his work more than their life together, how his son James had wanted to be a teacher, and Harold had called it wasting potential. Do you regret it? Maria asked one afternoon, surprising them both with the directness of the question. Every day, Harold admitted. I thought success meant controlling outcomes. Turns out it just meant being successfully alone. That evening, Harold saw Maria's son Miguel for the first time. The young man came to pick her up. Her car had broken down. Harold watched from his study window as Miguel helped his mother into an old Honda Civic, saw the way they laughed at something on the radio, saw the easy affection between them. The deadline for the medical school deposit was that night at midnight. Harold made a call to his lawyer. I want to create a medical scholarship fund, he said. Anonymous. For students who have full academic scholarships, but need help with living expenses. Start with 10 recipients this year. The first one goes to Miguel Santos, Maria's son. That's quite specific for an anonymous scholarship, his lawyer noted. Make it work, Harold said, and make sure it can't be traced back to me. 2 days later, Maria came to work with eyes red from crying. But for the first time in weeks, they were tears of joy. Mr. Whitmore, the most amazing thing happened. Miguel got a call from the medical school. An anonymous benefactor created a scholarship fund for living expenses. He's going to be a doctor. Her voice broke on the last word. Harold kept his face neutral, though something warm bloomed in his chest. That's wonderful news, Maria. He must have impressed someone with his potential. Maria nodded, wiping her eyes. He's worked so hard, studied every single day since he was 14, knowing this was his only shot. She paused, then added quietly, his father died when he was 12. Heart disease. Miguel decided that night he'd become a doctor. He said no other kid should lose their dad to something preventable. Harold's throat tightened. His own father had died of a heart attack when Harold was 30. But Harold had been too busy closing a merger to make it to the hospital in time. Over the following weeks, something fundamental changed in the Whitmore mansion. Maria still maintained professional boundaries, but their conversations grew richer. Harold learned about her immigration from El Salvador, her husband's death, her 2 jobs to put Miguel through undergraduate school. Maria learned about Harold's humble beginnings, his spectacular rise, his spectacular isolation. One evening, Harold asked, "Would Miguel like to have dinner here sometime? I'd be interested to hear about his plans for medical school." Maria hesitated. "Mr. Whitmore, that's kind of you, but—" "Not as employer and employee," Harold said quickly. "As friends, or at least 2 people trying to figure out what that might look like." Maria studied his face for a long moment. "I'll ask him." Miguel came to dinner the following Friday. He was nervous at first, clearly uncomfortable in the opulent dining room. But Harold had asked Maria to cook, not as an employee, but as a guest who happened to be providing the meal, and he served the food himself, fumbling only slightly with the serving spoons he'd never actually used before. "Maria tells me you're interested in cardiology," Harold said, passing the rice. Miguel nodded, his eyes bright. "Preventative cardiology, specifically. So many heart conditions can be managed with early intervention, but people in underserved communities often don't get diagnosed until it's too late." "Like your father," Harold said gently. Miguel met his eyes. "Yes, sir, like my father." They talked for 3 hours. Miguel's passion for medicine reminded Harold of his own early hunger for business, but Miguel's came from a place of service, not conquest. When the young man described his plans for mobile clinics in rural areas, Harold found himself leaning forward, asking questions, genuinely engaged in a way he hadn't been in years. "You know," Harold said as the evening wound down, "I've been thinking about my company's healthcare initiatives. We have the infrastructure, but lack the vision. Would you be interested in doing some consultation work? Paid, of course. Your insights could help us serve communities we're not reaching." Miguel glanced at his mother, then back at Harold. "Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate that, but I don't want any special treatment because my mom works for you." "Special treatment?" Harold laughed, a rusty sound. "Son, I'm offering you work because you have ideas I need. If anything, you'd be doing me the favor." Maria watched this exchange with something like wonder. She'd never seen Harold laugh before, really laugh, not the polite chuckle he used in phone calls. As they prepared to leave, Miguel shook Harold's hand. "Thank you for dinner, Mr. Whitmore, and for listening. Mom said you were different lately, but I didn't really understand until tonight." After they left, Harold stood in his empty dining room, realizing it didn't feel quite so empty anymore. The collaboration with Miguel began slowly. The young man would send Harold emails with ideas about community health initiatives, and Harold would respond with questions and resources. Their exchanges grew into weekly video calls, then bi-weekly dinners, where Maria would join them, no longer as the one serving, but as an equal participant in wide-ranging conversations. Harold discovered that Maria had a degree in accounting from El Salvador that wasn't recognized in the United States. She'd been managing her household finances with sophisticated strategies that rivaled some of his CFOs. Miguel revealed that he'd accepted to Harvard Medical School too, but chose UCSF to stay closer to his mother. "Family matters more than prestige," Miguel said simply, and Harold felt the words like a physical blow. That night, Harold called his son James for the first time in 2 years. The conversation was stilted, painful. James was suspicious, waiting for the catch, the condition, the control that always came with his father's attention. "I just wanted to know how you're doing," Harold said. "Why?" James asked bluntly. Harold was quiet for a moment. "Because I've been learning what I missed while I was building my empire. Turns out I missed everything that actually mattered." James didn't respond immediately. Then, "I'm teaching 5th grade in Portland. Married. You have a granddaughter. She's 3. Harold closed his eyes, absorbing the magnitude of what he'd missed. "What's her name?" "Sophie. After Mom." Harold's wife Sophie had died 5 years ago. He'd been in Hong Kong, closing a deal. "I'd like to meet her," Harold said quietly. "No strings. No judgments. Just if you'd let me." "I'll think about it," James said, and Harold recognized the same protective caution he'd heard in Maria's voice months ago. As fall approached and Miguel's medical school start date drew near, Harold found himself dreading the change. The dinners, the conversations, the sense of purpose Miguel's project had given him. It had filled spaces in his life he hadn't even known were empty. One evening, Maria approached him in his study. "Mr. Whitmore, I need to tell you something." Harold's stomach dropped. She was quitting. Of course she was. Miguel was starting school. She didn't need the job anymore, and "I know about the scholarship," Maria said quietly. Harold kept his face carefully neutral. "What scholarship?" Maria smiled, a real smile, not the polite professional one he'd seen for 15 years. "Mr. Whitmore, I've been balancing your books and managing your correspondence for years. I know your lawyer's billing patterns. I know your charitable giving history. And I know that an anonymous scholarship fund that specifically helps medical students with living expenses appeared exactly when Miguel needed it." Harold started to protest, but Maria held up a hand. "I also know that you did it in a way that preserved our dignity. You didn't make it about obligation or gratitude. You made it about investing in someone's potential." She pulled something from her pocket, a check. "This is the first payment on the loan you offered. I know you'll say the scholarship wasn't from you, and I'll pretend to believe you. But I'm paying back the loan anyway, because that was the deal we didn't quite make." Harold looked at the check, $500. "Maria, this is unnecessary." "No," she said firmly. "It's necessary, because this is how we stay equals. This is how we stay friends. You gave my son a chance to follow his dreams, but you did it in a way that let him earn it. Now let me earn my part too." Harold accepted the check, understanding that rejecting it would be rejecting more than money. That winter, James came to visit with his family. It was awkward at first. Years of hurt don't heal in a day. But at dinner, with Maria and Miguel joining them at Harold's insistence, something shifted. Sophie, 3 years old and fearless, climbed into Harold's lap and demanded he read her a story. "I don't really know how," Harold admitted. "It's easy," Sophie said with the confidence only a toddler can muster. "You just say the words and make the voices funny." So Harold read, making ridiculous voices that made Sophie giggle and even drew a smile from James. Maria and Miguel shared stories of their own family, and gradually, the formal dining room filled with something it had never held before, the messy, complicated, beautiful noise of family. As the evening ended, James pulled Harold aside. "Who are these people to you?" he asked, nodding toward Maria and Miguel. Harold thought for a moment. "They're the family who taught me what I should have been teaching you all along, that success means nothing if you achieve it alone." James studied his father's face. "You've changed." "I'm trying to," Harold said. "It's probably too late, but—" "It's not too late," James said quietly. "Sophie needs a grandfather, and maybe I need to see if my father can become the man I see tonight." The following months brought slow but steady change. James visited more frequently. Harold flew to Portland for Sophie's 4th birthday, bringing not expensive toys, but his presence, his attention, his terrible but enthusiastic voices reading bedtime stories. Miguel started medical school but continued consulting on Harold's community health initiatives. The project had grown into a $10 million investment in mobile clinics. Harold insisted on paying Miguel a proper consultant's fee, and Miguel insisted on earning every penny through detailed proposals and implementation plans. Maria, meanwhile, had quietly become indispensable in a new way. She still managed Harold's household, but now she also reviewed his charitable giving, suggesting organizations that actually made a difference rather than just made good photo opportunities. Her accounting background emerged fully, and Harold found himself trusting her judgment on financial matters more than some of his executives. One day, Harold made a proposal that surprised them both. "I want you to be my chief household operations officer," he said. "Same responsibilities, but with the title and salary you've actually deserved all along. Plus, I want you to help me establish a foundation, one that helps other kids like Miguel reach their potential." Maria looked skeptical. "You want me to run a foundation? I don't have the credentials." You have 15 years of experience managing complex operations, a degree in accounting, and you've raised a son who earned a full scholarship to medical school while working 2 jobs. Harold said, "Those are credentials enough." Maria considered this. "I'll do it on one condition. We do this as partners, not employer and employee. Equal say in decisions." Harold extended his hand. Partners. One evening, almost a year after that first overheard phone call, Harold found himself in his study again. But this time, he wasn't alone. Sophie was coloring at his feet. James was reviewing lesson plans on the couch. Maria was at the desk working on foundation proposals, and Miguel was on a video call from the medical school library, updating them on his cardiology rotation. Harold's phone buzzed with a message from his CFO about a major acquisition opportunity. He glanced at it, then set the phone aside. Sophie had just handed him a drawing of what might have been a house or possibly a dinosaur, and she was waiting for his response with serious eyes. "This is magnificent," Harold said solemnly. "Tell me about it." As Sophie launched into an elaborate explanation involving a princess dinosaur who lived in a castle made of cookies, Harold caught Maria's eye. She smiled, that real smile he'd only recently learned to recognize, and returned to her work. The marble floors were still there. The fortune was still vast. But the silence was gone, replaced by Sophie's chatter, Miguel's laughter from the laptop, James's quiet questions about his father's early business days. The footsteps in the hallway no longer tried to avoid notice. They moved with purpose, with belonging. Harold had spent 50 years building an empire. It had taken him less than 1 year to learn that empires mean nothing compared to a 3-year-old's trust, a son's tentative forgiveness, and the friendship of 2 people who had shown him that real wealth isn't what you control. It's who you choose to stand beside, and who chooses to stand beside you in return. That night, as everyone prepared to leave, Miguel shook Harold's hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "Not for the scholarship, though I'm grateful for that. Thank you for seeing my mother as more than what she could do for you. Thank you for becoming someone my mother could be proud to call a friend." Harold's throat was tight. "Your mother saved me," he said quietly. "I just didn't know I needed saving until I heard her trying to save you." Maria overheard this. She walked over and, for the first time in 16 years, hugged her employer, her partner, her friend. "We saved each other," she said. "That's what people do when they finally see each other clearly." As the house emptied and Harold walked through the quiet rooms, he thought about that morning he'd pretended to sleep. Such a small deception, born of nothing more than drowsiness and chance, but had opened a door he hadn't even known was closed. He stopped in the kitchen, where that first real conversation had happened. The check he'd written still lived in his memory, refused but not forgotten, a first attempt at connection that had failed because he hadn't yet learned that real generosity isn't about giving money. It's about giving opportunity, respect, and most importantly, the gift of truly being seen. Tomorrow, Miguel would present his first patient case study. James would bring Sophie for the weekend. Maria would arrive not as a housekeeper, but as the foundation's co-director, and they would review applications from students whose dreams were bigger than their bank accounts. Harold stood at the window, looking out at gardens that no longer felt like fortress walls. Somewhere out there, kids like Miguel were studying by flashlight, believing in futures they couldn't quite afford. Parents like Maria were working multiple jobs, invisible to the people they served. And men like Harold, successful, isolated, accidentally sleeping through their actual lives, were waiting for someone to wake them up. The morning he'd pretended to sleep had become the morning he'd finally woken up. And in the end, that made all the difference. The marble floors still echoed with footsteps, but now Harold knew exactly whose they were, where they were going, and why they mattered. And for the first time in his 79 years, he understood that the greatest fortune he'd ever built wasn't measured in billions. It was measured in the sound of Maria laughing at Miguel's terrible doctor jokes, in Sophie's drawings covering his once pristine refrigerator, in James slowly learning to trust again, and in the quiet certainty that tomorrow would bring not another day of empire building, but another day of something infinitely more valuable, Another day of belonging to something bigger than himself. Another day of being truly, completely, finally awake.